Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe.
This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Monday, March 5th, 2007, started like any other quiet morning in the small town of Maplewood, Michigan. The streets were lined with budding maple trees, their new leaves catching the first light of spring, and the scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the corner cafes. In this serene town, life moved slowly, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and strangers were noticed immediately. It was the kind of place where nothing terrible seemed possible, until it was. 13-year-old Emily Parker and 14-year-old Sarah Whitman, known as Em and Sarah to their friends, were inseparable. Their friendship had begun in the second grade, cemented over shared secrets, lunch table jokes, and countless sleepovers. On that Sunday evening, the girls had gathered at Sarah's home, which sat on the edge of town near the edge of Maplewood Creek. Emily had brought a new sketchbook and a set of watercolor paints, eager to try out the techniques she had learned in art class. For hours, the two girls worked on their projects in Sarah's attic bedroom, sprawled across the floor with paints, pencils, and brushes scattered around them. Later, they moved their playful energy outside, tossing a softball back and forth in Sarah's fenced backyard, laughing as the ball occasionally bounced into the flower beds. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, their conversation had turned toward adventure. Both girls were curious, restless, and tired of the predictable confines of their town. When they discovered that Monday would be a rare school holiday, their excitement only grew. They wanted to explore, to do something memorable, to carve out a day that belonged entirely to them. By the next afternoon, they had formulated a plan. The destination was Willow Creek Reserve, a wooded nature area about 5 miles outside Maplewood. The reserve had earned a quiet reputation among local teenagers as a place to wander, explore the old trails, and enjoy the views from the vantage points above the creek. Most notably, the reserve included the old Ironwood Bridge, built in 1894 as part of a now defunct railway line. The bridge's steel framework and wooden planks had long been abandoned, but its height and vantage made it a favorite spot for locals to take photographs, sketch, or simply watch the water flow beneath. Em and Sarah convinced Sarah's older brother, Tyler, to drive them to the reserve. He agreed reluctantly, warning them to be careful and to return before dark. By 1:45 p.m., the girls were dropped off near the trailhead that led to Ironwood Bridge. The area exuded both charm and a subtle sense of isolation. The trees stood tall and dense, their branches forming natural arches over the worn dirt paths. The occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze filled the silence. It was the perfect scene for adventure, or so it seemed. At 2:10 p.m., Sarah sent a quick photo to their group chat, capturing Emily cautiously stepping across the weathered wooden planks of the Ironwood Bridge. That photo would later become one of the final glimpses of the girls alive. They explored the trails for about an hour, venturing farther than usual. They paused at clearings where the sun filtered down through the canopy, laughing as they balanced on fallen logs or compared their sketches. They were aware of the isolation, but felt secure. The reserve was familiar territory, and they had each other. But as they wandered deeper, the sense of adventure began to blend with vulnerability. The bridge, towering over the creek below, seemed beautiful yet imposing, the silence of the surrounding woods amplifying every footstep. Meanwhile, back in town, Tyler waited, scrolling on his phone, unaware of the tension about to unfold. When 3:30 p.m. rolled around, the girls hadn't messaged or returned a call. At first, Tyler assumed they were caught up in an activity or exploring farther than expected, but by 4 p.m., unease began to creep in. He called Sarah's parents, who immediately felt a cold knot of anxiety in their stomachs. They attempted to contact Emily's mother, who had been preparing dinner at home. Panic quietly seeped into the day as the mothers dialed the girls' phones repeatedly. Each unanswered ring increased their dread. By late afternoon, the worry had transformed into fear. The families retraced the girls' likely paths, walking along the trails themselves, calling out their names. The quiet of Willow Creek Reserve seemed to respond only with more silence. Tyler retraced the route with his parents in tow, scanning the brush for any sign of movement. Each snap of a twig or rustle in the leaves caused a momentary jolt of hope that quickly faded when they realized it was only the wind. Authorities were contacted just before nightfall. Initially, the search was small, conducted by local law enforcement officers, but as darkness settled over the trees, flashlights flickered in the woods like scattered stars as neighbors, friends, and volunteers joined the search. The reserve, once a place of peace, was now a scene of tension and unease. Search parties moved systematically through the trails, calling the girls' names, but their voices were swallowed by the dense foliage. The first night ended without success. Law enforcement assured the families that there was no evidence the girls were in immediate danger and that searches would resume at first light. But sleep brought little comfort. In the quiet homes of Maplewood, parents lay awake imagining every possible scenario, refusing to admit the possibility that something terrible had occurred. The following morning, March 6th, the search resumed in earnest. Volunteers spread out across every path, wading through streams and climbing over fallen trees. Drones were brought in to survey the bridge and the surrounding treetops, scanning for any anomalies that might indicate the girls' presence. Around mid-morning, a searcher found them. It was devastating. Emily and Sarah had been murdered less than a mile from the point where Tyler had dropped them off the previous day. The shock reverberated through the small town. Maplewood, a community of roughly 4,000 residents, had never confronted violence of this magnitude. The very reality of what had happened seemed almost impossible to process. The very woods that had once offered adventure and serenity now carried the weight of horror. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from Sarah's own phone. While exploring the bridge, she had recorded a brief video of Endley waffling across the planks. Within that video, a man could be heard and partially seen following them. The authorities named him Bridge Stranger. His presence was subtle but chilling, the ordinary nature of the footage masking the threat captured in those fleeting moments. The authorities released still frames from the video to the public, hoping someone would recognize the man. They described him as a white male, approximately 5'8", with reddish-brown hair, wearing a blue jacket, jeans, and a hooded sweatshirt. Witnesses also reported seeing someone fitting this description along the trail on the day the girls disappeared. Despite these releases and sketches based on eyewitness accounts, no arrests were made. The authorities continued their investigation, focusing on individuals who lived in Maplewood or were familiar with Willow Creek Reserve. The suspect had to know the area, as the bodies had been found in locations that suggested careful planning. Law enforcement appealed to the public, urging anyone with information to come forward, emphasizing that the suspect may be hiding in plain sight. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the case remained unsolved. The bridge stranger remained an enigma, his voice and movements recorded in the short clip from Sarah's phone, but his identity elusive. The community's sense of security was shattered. Parents no longer allowed their children to wander alone, and the woods were avoided, the bridge abandoned. Maplewood, a town defined by quiet mornings and safe adventures, became synonymous with loss, suspicion, and fear. The case of Emily Parker and Sarah Whitman became the central focus of investigators' efforts, with every tip, sighting, and lead meticulously followed. The bridge stranger's voice, calm, unremarkable, yet undeniably menacing, haunted both the investigators and the community. The mystery of how someone could commit such a crime so close to home, in broad daylight, remained a pressing and terrifying question. By the time spring deepened, Willow Creek Reserve was cordoned off, the trails under surveillance, the bridge a silent witness to the horror that had occurred. Maplewood's community meetings were filled with parents and residents demanding answers. The search for justice became a marathon, with investigators examining cell phone records, scrutinizing the girls' social media interactions, and revisiting every clue they could find. But for every piece of information uncovered, another layer of the mystery seemed to emerge, deepening the tragedy. The first part of the investigation established the grim reality: two best friends lost to violence, and a town struggling to reconcile its serene image with the darkness that had intruded upon it. The bridge stranger remained at large, a haunting presence in the lives of everyone who had known Emily and Sarah. The path toward justice would prove long, complicated, and full of unexpected turns, setting the stage for a story that would grip the community for years to come. In the weeks following the discovery of Emily Parker and Sarah Whitman, Maplewood had transformed from a sleepy town into a place haunted by grief and suspicion. Police set up a temporary command post at the edge of Willow Creek Reserve, coordinating search efforts, interviewing witnesses, and compiling the mountain of tips that poured in from both residents and strangers alike. Flyers featuring the girls' photographs and the bridge stranger's grainy still images appeared on every lamppost, grocery store bulletin, and gas station window. Social media exploded with discussions, theories, and at times cruel speculation. Detective Laura Mitchell, who had recently been assigned to the Maplewood Police Department, was put in charge of the investigation. She was known for her meticulous nature and calm demeanor, traits that would become crucial in a case where almost every lead seemed to spiral into dead ends. Laura began by retracing the girls' final steps along the trails leading to Ironwood Bridge. Every fallen branch, every piece of litter, every scuff on the dirt path was examined. She insisted on reviewing the 43-second video recorded on Sarah's phone repeatedly, frame by frame. Within that brief clip, she and her team could make out the faint shape of a man walking behind the girls, his voice softly audible, instructing them with a chilling "come down the hill." Authorities initially hoped that the man could be identified quickly, but months passed with no concrete leads. Several men were interviewed, and some even temporarily considered persons of interest, yet no definitive evidence linked anyone to the crime. Among those questioned was a local man named Joseph Keating, who lived near the reserve. Keating had no criminal record and claimed to have been fishing with friends the afternoon of the girl's disappearance, but investigators kept him in mind due to his proximity to the crime scene. In early April, the FBI stepped in, bringing additional resources and experience to the case. The Bureau obtained warrants to search multiple properties near Willow Creek Reserve, hoping to find clues such as fibers, hair samples, or digital footprints. During this time, several troubling details emerged. The bodies of Emily and Sarah had been staged in specific positions, suggesting a level of planning or ritualistic behavior. Emily was fully clothed, yet parts of Sarah's clothing were missing. Branches had been deliberately arranged on her body, and smaller sticks were positioned in patterns that seemed intentional. Blood tests confirmed that both girls had died from throat wounds, but the scene lacked significant signs of struggle. Investigators believed the killer might have moved the bodies after the murders, which only complicated the timeline. One of the most frustrating elements of the investigation was the bridge stranger video. Only short clips had been publicly released, but the authorities knew the full footage contained more subtle evidence. The way the man moved, his gait, even the sound of his voice could potentially be used to identify him. Forensic audio experts worked tirelessly to enhance the recordings, while sketch artists created new composites based on witness descriptions. The man was consistently described as white, between 5'7" and 5'10" inches tall, weighing roughly 180 to 210 pounds, with reddish-brown hair and wearing a hooded jacket. Yet these details, while precise, did not yield a suspect who matched all criteria. Over the following months, several names surfaced in connection with the case. One early lead involved a man named Ronald Langston, an older resident of Maplewood who lived less than a mile from the reserve. Langston had a history of minor legal troubles, including a DUI conviction, and at first glance, his proximity to the crime scene raised concerns. He told police he had been out of town the afternoon the girls disappeared, claiming he was visiting a relative in a neighboring city. However, investigators soon discovered inconsistencies in his alibi. A cousin whom Langston had asked to corroborate his story later admitted she had lied to help him. Despite intense scrutiny, including searches of his property and vehicle, no concrete evidence tied Langston to the murders. His presence on the radar gradually faded, particularly after he passed away a few years later. Attention then shifted to a man named Kevin Monroe, a 30-year-old with a disturbing history of online predation. Monroe had used fake social media accounts to solicit inappropriate images from minors, some of whom were from Maplewood and surrounding towns. Investigators discovered that Sarah had been in contact with one of Monroe's accounts on the day she was murdered. While Monroe never met Sarah in person and was not directly linked to the murders, this connection raised serious questions about whether he could have been aware of the girl's movements. Investigators searched Monroe's home and confiscated computers and phones, finding evidence of illicit activity that led to his arrest on charges of child exploitation. He ultimately pled guilty and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but investigators were careful to note that this did not solve Emily and Sarah's murders. The town's anxiety only intensified as months passed. Parents kept their children close, and community gatherings often included discussions about safety and vigilance. Maplewood streets and trails were no longer spaces of carefree exploration, but of constant caution. Detective Mitchell and her team worked around the clock, yet each lead seemed to lead to frustration. Forensic reports, witness interviews, and digital evidence analyses produced pieces of information, but the puzzle remained incomplete. By late 2008, the investigation began to take a darker turn. Analysts suggested that the killings might not have been random. The staging of the bodies, the careful positioning of branches, and certain symbols drawn in the soil near the scene pointed to someone with ritualistic knowledge or an obsessive mindset. Some law enforcement officers quietly speculated that the perpetrator could have ties to fringe beliefs or practices, though these theories were never publicly confirmed. The notion of a premeditated act carried out with such deliberate attention to detail intensified both fear and fascination among Maplewood residents. Amid these developments, Detective Mitchell continued to focus on the bridge stranger video. Forensic audio analysts managed to enhance the voice in the clip, creating a clearer recording that could be compared to suspects. Experts described the man's tone as calm and controlled, with subtle inflections that suggested familiarity with the area. Yet no immediate matches emerged from voice databases, leaving the case suspended in a state of eerie uncertainty. The investigation into digital footprints also revealed another unnerving detail. Sarah had been documenting her day meticulously, taking photos and sending messages to friends. Some of these interactions included seemingly casual references to their plans, but authorities noted that these digital breadcrumbs provided clues the perpetrator might have exploited. Whoever the bridge stranger was, he appeared to know the terrain, the timing, and even the girl's habits. This knowledge suggested a local connection, someone who had observed the town closely, waiting for the right moment. Public pressure on law enforcement continued to mount. Town hall meetings were filled with frustrated residents demanding answers. Local newspapers ran weekly updates detailing every known lead, from false sightings to suspects cleared by the FBI. Parents organized volunteer patrols along trails and near the bridge, hoping to prevent further tragedy. The psychological toll on the community was palpable. Many people reported sleepless nights, anxiety when walking their dogs in the evening, and a pervasive sense that Maplewood would never return to the carefree town it had once been. Despite the chaos, Detective Mitchell remained focused. She organized workshops on child safety for schools and youth groups, hoping to turn the tragedy into a teachable moment even as the investigation continued. She also coordinated with state and federal authorities to expand the search beyond Maplewood, sharing evidence, surveillance footage, and witness accounts in hopes of connecting with anyone who might recognize the bridge stranger. As the first anniversary of the girls' deaths approached, Maplewood's residents struggled to cope. Candlelight vigils were held at the bridge, with parents, friends, and neighbors gathering to remember Emily and Sarah. Handmade posters adorned the trees near the trails, each one featuring drawings, photographs, and heartfelt messages. The small town, though shaken, showed remarkable resilience. The community's grief was deep, but so was its determination to see justice served. By now, the case had attracted national attention. True crime forums, podcasts, and news outlets covered every update, analyzing the bridge stranger video and speculating about potential suspects. Tips poured in from across the country, and law enforcement had to sift through mountains of information, separating credible leads from rumors. Even with federal involvement, the bridge stranger remained unidentified and the murders unsolved. Detective Mitchell, aware of the media attention, approached every tip with caution. She knew that one false lead could derail months of careful investigation, yet the pressure to act was relentless. The case had become a test of patience, persistence, and forensic ingenuity. The bridge stranger, whoever he was, had left the town with a haunting reminder that evil could exist in the most familiar of places. And so, Maplewood remained suspended in fear and uncertainty. Willow Creek Reserve, once a place of beauty and adventure, had become a monument to tragedy. The Ironwood Bridge stood as a silent witness, the wooden planks and steel beams etched with memories of a final, terrifying day. As Detective Mitchell and her team continued their work, the town held its breath, waiting for a breakthrough that could finally bring the girl's killer to justice. The investigation was far from over, and as the case stretched on into years, the bridge stranger loomed as an ominous presence, a reminder that some evil hides in plain sight, and that sometimes it takes patience, persistence, and an unyielding pursuit of truth to uncover it. Years passed, and the town of Maplewood carried the weight of Emily Parker and Sarah Whitman's murders. Each year brought reminders of that terrible day, anniversaries marked by vigils, memorials by the Ironwood Bridge, and an enduring fear that the bridge stranger was still among them. Yet for Detective Laura Mitchell, giving up was never an option. Every tip, every scrap of evidence, every interview mattered. She knew that even the smallest breakthrough could unravel years of dead ends. In late 2022, an unexpected development finally shifted the investigation. A man named Richard Caldwell, a 50-year-old Maplewood resident who had worked at the local pharmacy for decades and was known to his neighbors as a quiet, friendly family man, came under scrutiny. Caldwell's connection to the town, and more importantly to the bridge trails, caught the attention of investigators. He had been a familiar figure, walking the trails for years, often seen carrying supplies for local nature programs or visiting with his dog. On the day of the murders, multiple witnesses recalled seeing someone matching Caldwell's description in the area near the Ironwood Bridge. His clothing, dark hoodie, blue jacket, and jeans, strangely matched the description of the bridge stranger. Detectives quickly reviewed past interviews and evidence. It emerged that Caldwell had voluntarily contacted authorities years earlier, offering to recount his movements on the day of the girl's disappearance. At the time, he provided details about seeing other hikers and even some young girls near the trails, but he claimed his contact with them was brief and insignificant. Investigators initially cleared him because nothing tied him directly to the murders, but when combined with witness sightings from the day and the fact that he had never moved or disposed of any possessions in the years since, Caldwell's presence could no longer be dismissed. Further scrutiny revealed additional inconsistencies. For example, a bullet recovered near the crime scene was identified as a .40 caliber, and records indicated that Caldwell owned a firearm of the same type. While ballistics testing and chain of custody questions complicated the matter, experts noted that the bullet's condition and location near the girls' bodies made it a critical piece of evidence. Investigators also reviewed hundreds of phone calls, financial records, and digital activity, searching for anything that might link Caldwell to the murders. His online activity appeared unremarkable at first, but investigators remained vigilant, combing through communications for hidden connections to the victims. The breakthrough came when authorities reviewed jail calls, prior interactions, and other conversations that Caldwell had with family members. In several private conversations, he allegedly admitted to his role in the murders. These admissions were reportedly made during phone calls with his wife and, in some instances, with his mother. Although the defense later claimed these confessions were coerced due to his mental health deterioration in prison, investigators considered them a crucial turning point. The nature of his confessions suggested premeditation and knowledge of details that had never been publicly disclosed. The community was stunned when Caldwell was arrested. People who had known him for decades struggled to reconcile his friendly, helpful demeanor with the accusations. Neighbors described him as quiet and polite, someone who attended community events and even printed memorial photos for Emily and Sarah's families. Yet the very familiarity that had kept suspicion at bay also highlighted the horrifying reality. The killer had been hiding in plain sight. As the investigation deepened, forensic experts and psychologists worked to piece together how Caldwell could have committed the murders alone. The staging of the body suggested careful planning. Emily's clothing and Sarah's missing garments indicated deliberate manipulation of the scene, and the arrangement of sticks and branches hinted at ritualistic tendencies. Blood spatter analysis showed minimal transfer onto Caldwell's clothing, suggesting he had been meticulous in avoiding contamination. DNA testing further complicated the prosecution's case. No trace of Caldwell's DNA was found at the scene, and no evidence of Emily or Sarah's DNA appeared on items recovered from his home. The trial began in late 2024, drawing national attention. Prosecutors focused on Caldwell's confessions, the ballistics evidence, and the alignment between witness descriptions and his known appearance. Detective Mitchell testified about her analysis of the bridge stranger recording, asserting that the voice in the recording matched Caldwell's voice in enhanced audio clips. She also described the geographic knowledge the killer displayed, noting that Caldwell's familiarity with the area would have allowed him to execute the murders and stage the scene without attracting attention. The defense countered aggressively. They argued that Caldwell's confessions were unreliable, made under duress, and in the context of extreme mental distress during his confinement. They emphasized the lack of DNA evidence connecting him to the crime and raised the possibility of an alternative theory involving individuals with knowledge of Norse paganism or ritualistic symbolism, citing the carefully arranged branches and symbolic markings at the crime scene. The defense also suggested that law enforcement had overlooked or destroyed evidence that might have pointed to other suspects. They claimed that investigators had suppressed theories that did not fit the narrative implicating Caldwell. Witness testimony added another layer of complexity. Several residents recalled seeing Caldwell in the vicinity of the reserve on the day of the murders, while others provided accounts that contradicted his earlier statements about his whereabouts. Psychological experts described the behavior exhibited by the murderer at the scene, noting the calculated manner in which the bodies were staged and the potential ritualistic aspects of the crime. The prosecution argued that Caldwell's pattern of confession, demeanor, and movements were consistent with the behavior of someone with intimate knowledge of the crime scene. Despite the defense's arguments, the prosecution presented compelling evidence connecting Caldwell to the murders. Detailed analysis of the bullet found at the scene, combined with witness accounts and enhanced video footage, painted a consistent picture of his presence at the Ironwood Bridge on the day of the tragedy. Additionally, his repeated admissions in private conversations, corroborated by phone records, suggested a consciousness of guilt. The prosecution argued that even without DNA evidence, the weight of circumstantial and testimonial evidence was sufficient for conviction. In November 2024, after weeks of intense testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Richard Caldwell was found guilty on all counts, including the murders of Emily Parker and Sarah Whitman. The courtroom was tense as the sentence was read. Judge Harold Whitmore handed down consecutive sentences, 65 years for each murder, totaling 130 years without the possibility of early parole. Caldwell was immediately transported to the state correctional facility to begin serving his sentence. Relief washed over some members of the community, while others grappled with the disbelief that someone so ordinary in appearance could commit such horrors. Yet, even with the conviction, many questions lingered. How had Caldwell avoided suspicion for so long, despite numerous sketches, witness accounts, and the Bridge Stranger video? Why did it take over 5 years for authorities to connect the final dots? Some critics pointed to the timing of the arrest, which coincided with a contested local election, raising suspicions that political pressure might have accelerated the resolution. Others speculated that Caldwell's ordinary lifestyle and unassuming presence allowed him to blend seamlessly into the town, avoiding scrutiny for years. The trial also left lingering concerns about mental health and legal process. Caldwell's behavior in prison before his arrest, including erratic actions and rapid deterioration, highlighted the psychological toll of long-term confinement and investigation. The defense argued that these factors may have contributed to unreliable confessions, while the prosecution maintained that Caldwell's admissions and consistent knowledge of the crime scene confirmed his guilt. Maplewood, for its part, began a slow process of healing. The Ironwood Bridge remained a somber landmark, a site where the community honored Emily and Sarah while grappling with the memory of their final hours. Schools implemented enhanced safety protocols, parents remained vigilant, and law enforcement reinforced the importance of digital safety and community awareness. The tragedy had reshaped the town, creating an enduring awareness that evil could lurk in even the most familiar places. For Detective Laura Mitchell, the case was both a victory and a sobering reminder of the complexities of criminal investigation. She reflected on the painstaking work that had finally led to Caldwell's conviction, recognizing that each piece of evidence, each witness interview, and each subtle clue had contributed to the outcome. Yet she also understood that the case underscored the limitations of forensic science, the challenges of human memory, and the unpredictable nature of criminal behavior. In the end, justice had been served, but at an immense cost. The lives of Emily Parker and Sarah Whitman could never be restored, and the impact of their loss would resonate for generations in Maplewood. The Bridge Stranger story, once a chilling unknown, had been resolved, yet the haunting images of that day, two friends walking along the trail, laughter abruptly silenced, remained etched in the minds of all who remembered. As Maplewood moved forward, the lessons of the case lingered. Vigilance, community awareness, and the relentless pursuit of truth were essential in preventing tragedy. While the town would never forget, it had reclaimed a measure of peace, knowing that the person responsible for such unspeakable violence had finally been held accountable. The bridge, the trails, and the woods remained, standing as silent witnesses to the dark shadow that had passed through, but also to the resilience and determination of a community that refused to let fear define them. In the spring of 1987, the town of Briar Glen, Oregon, was the kind of place where people forgot to lock their doors. It sat between dense fir forests and a wide, slow-moving river called the Alderwash. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on. Neighbors borrowed sugar without asking. The worst crime most residents could remember was a string of mailbox vandalism the previous summer. That illusion shattered on May 14. At 6:40 a.m., a fisherman named Carl Hensley followed his usual path along the riverbank just south of Mercer Bridge. The morning fog clung low to the water. He almost didn't notice the pale shape tangled in the reeds. At first, he thought it was a discarded mannequin. Then he saw the hair. The girl couldn't have been older than 25. By 8:15 a.m., deputies from the Briar County Sheriff's Office had sealed off the area. Detective Ronan Hale, 38 years old and only 3 years into homicide investigations, stood near the river's edge trying to steady his breathing. He had seen death before, but not like this. Not someone so young. Not someone left exposed to the elements as if she were nothing. There was no identification on her, no purse, no obvious defensive wounds. She wore jeans, a faded green sweatshirt, and a silver locket without initials. The medical examiner would later determine she had been strangled, likely with a cord. The estimated time of death, between midnight and 3 a.m. No witnesses reported screams. No cars were seen parked along the gravel shoulder that night. By afternoon, the girl had a name, though it was one the detectives invented, Alder Jane. It was shorthand for reports, easier than writing unknown female, case 87-0415 over and over. Within days, missing persons reports were pulled from Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Dozens of families were called in. Dental records were compared manually, one by one. In 1987, there was no central digital system. Everything moved through fax machines, photocopies, and phone calls that went unanswered for days. 2 weeks later, the FBI lab confirmed that semen collected during autopsy yielded a usable DNA profile. That detail felt like a breakthrough, except it wasn't. DNA testing in the late 1980s was still new, expensive, and mostly theoretical in small jurisdictions. The Briar County lab couldn't run it. Samples were sent to a state facility in Salem. Months passed before the profile was documented. There was nowhere to compare it. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, would not become widely operational for years. The evidence was carefully sealed, labeled, and placed in refrigerated storage. And then the trail went cold. Over the next 5 years, Detective Hale chased every lead: a traveling carnival worker who'd passed through town, a long-haul trucker with a prior assault record, a local mechanic rumored to have a temper. Each theory burned bright for a few weeks, then collapsed under alibis or lack of physical evidence. The case file thickened, the suspect list thinned. By 1993, Alder Jane's photograph, reconstructed from forensic sketches, had yellowed in the evidence binder. She remained unidentified. No one came forward to claim her. No family called from another state saying, "That's my daughter." The most unsettling possibility began to settle over the department. Maybe no one was looking for her. Hale carried that thought like a weight. It wasn't just about solving a homicide anymore, it was about restoring a name. In 1998, Broward County elected a new sheriff who prioritized drug enforcement over cold cases. Budget reallocations meant fewer hours devoted to unsolved homicides. Hale was reassigned. Alder Jane's file moved into a metal cabinet labeled cold storage. The DNA sample remained preserved, frozen in time. Fast forward to 2018. The Broward County Sheriff's Office looked different. Renovated lobby, digital filing systems, a new generation of deputies who had grown up with the internet. Detective Mara Ionescu transferred in from Portland that summer. 32 years old, Romanian-American, sharp-eyed and methodical, she had a reputation for revisiting cases others dismissed. During her second week, she asked a simple question in a staff meeting. How many unsolved homicides do we have pre-2000? The room shifted uncomfortably. 37, a lieutenant answered. Some are skeletal remains, some are bad evidence, some are just old. Mara requested access to the files. She spent evenings reading through faded transcripts and grainy photos. When she reached case 87-0415, something about it gripped her. The anonymity, the lack of identity, the preserved DNA profile noted in a 1990 addendum. She walked into the evidence room the next morning. "Do we still have the biological sample from Alder Jane?" she asked the technician. He checked the digital inventory. If it wasn't contaminated or discarded, yes, it's in long-term freezer storage. Mara had been following developments in forensic genealogy. In 2018, the arrest of the Golden State Killer through public genealogy databases had sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities. Investigators had uploaded crime scene DNA, identified distant relatives through shared genetic markers, and built family trees backward until they narrowed in on a suspect. It was controversial. It raised privacy debates, but it worked. What would it take, she asked carefully, to reprocess that DNA for genealogical comparison? The technician blinked. That's not standard CODIS submission. I know, I'm talking about SNP testing, consumer-level profile conversion, like what private labs do. He leaned back. Funding, authorization, and a lab willing to take it. Mara wrote a proposal. She detailed the technological advances since 1987. She cited solved cases across the country. She acknowledged ethical concerns and outlined compliance with current guidelines, including using only opt-in public databases that allowed law enforcement matching. It took 3 months. In January 2019, Broward County approved the budget. A portion of Alder Jane's preserved DNA was shipped to a specialized lab in Texas capable of generating a single nucleotide polymorphism profile compatible with genealogy platforms. For the first time in over 3 decades, the evidence moved forward instead of sitting still. The results came back in April. There was no direct match, meaning the killer had not personally uploaded his DNA to a public database. That was expected. But there were several partial matches, third and fourth cousins, distant relatives scattered across the Midwest. Mara stared at the spreadsheet of centimorgan values and shared segments. It looked abstract, almost meaningless, but she knew what it represented: a map. She contacted a volunteer genealogist named Thomas Avery, a retired librarian who had assisted law enforcement before. They met in a small conference room with printed family trees spread across the table. Thomas adjusted his glasses. These 2 matches share about 120 centimorgans with the profile, likely second cousins once removed, or third cousins. "So we build backward?" Mara asked. "Exactly. We identify common ancestors from the 1800s, then we build forward, every descendant, every branch." It was painstaking work: birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, social media profiles. It felt less like police work and more like historical research. Weeks turned into months. a pattern began to emerge. Several of the DNA matches traced back to a farming family in western Nebraska. The ancestral couple, Elias and Margaret Whitmore, had 9 children. Over generations, their descendants scattered across the country. One branch led to Oregon, specifically to a man named Daniel Whitmore, born 1962, who had relocated to the Pacific Northwest in the mid-1980s for seasonal construction jobs. Mara pulled his background. In 1987, Daniel would have been 25, the same approximate age as the unidentified victim. He had no major criminal record, a few minor citations, nothing violent. In 1992, he moved to Idaho. In 2004, he died in a single-vehicle accident. Dead suspects complicate cases, but they don't erase truth. Before we jump, Mara said during a strategy meeting, we need to confirm whether Alder Jane is connected to this Whitmore line as victim or suspect. The genealogical match is from the crime scene DNA. That could belong to the killer or a consensual partner. We still don't know who she is. That realization shifted the direction of the investigation. They had been chasing the killer's family tree. But what if the DNA pointed to the victim's relatives instead? The lab re-examined the sample. The semen profile was isolated and confirmed male. That meant the genealogical matches were tied to the perpetrator, not the victim. Mara felt the air leave her lungs. If Daniel Whitmore was the right branch, then somewhere in that family tree was a man who stood by the Alder Wash River in 1987 and ended a life. But Daniel was dead, which meant the story was more complicated. In July 2019, Mara and Thomas refined the tree further. They identified 3 male Whitmore descendants living in Oregon in the mid-1980s, all between 20 and 35 years old. One was Daniel. The second was his older cousin, Patrick Whitmore, who had briefly worked in Briar Glen in 1986 before returning to Nebraska. The third was someone no one had noticed before, a man named Lucas Hale. No relation to Detective Ronan Hale. Lucas Hale had been adopted in 1965 by a Whitmore daughter after a private placement. His biological lineage tied back to Elias and Margaret Whitmore. He grew up in Oregon. In 1987, he was 28 years old and living 15 miles from Briar Glen. Mara felt the familiar tightening in her chest that signaled momentum. Lucas Hale was alive. He had never been interviewed in the original investigation, and he had no idea that a decision made by distant relatives uploading DNA kits decades later might now be narrowing the circle around him. By the time Lucas Hale's name surfaced in Detective Mara Ionescu's working file, the investigation had already stretched across 3 decades and half the country. What had once been a grainy photograph in a metal cabinet was now a digital web of shared centimorgans, birth records, and genetic probabilities. The science was clean. The human part was not. Lucas Hale was 59 years old in 2019. He lived alone outside the small town of Dry Creek, Oregon, about 40 minutes east of Briar Glen. Property records showed a modest manufactured home on 2 acres of land. Employment history listed seasonal logging, warehouse shifts, and a few stretches of unemployment. No felony convictions, a disorderly conduct charge in 1991 that had been dismissed, nothing that would have placed him on anyone's radar. Mara did not believe in coincidences, but she respected caution. The genealogical analysis had narrowed the suspect pool to 3 men connected through the Whitmore line. Daniel Whitmore was deceased. Patrick Whitmore had been in Nebraska at the time of the murder, supported by payroll records and a dated workplace injury claim. That left Lucas. Still, genealogy alone was not proof. It was a compass, not a verdict. Before making contact, Mara wanted to understand the victim. For 32 years, the young woman had been known only as Alder Jane. If the suspect tree was pointing toward the Whitmore lineage, it was possible the victim had a connection to the same region. She reopened the unidentified persons file and reviewed the details with fresh eyes. Female, approximately 20 to 26 years old, brown hair, healed fracture in left wrist from childhood, silver locket with a pressed wildflower inside. The wildflower detail lingered. Mara contacted a forensic botanist at Oregon State University and emailed high-resolution photos of the pressed specimen preserved in evidence. 2 days later, the botanist called back. "It's a prairie coneflower," he said, native to Central Plains regions, Nebraska, Kansas, parts of South Dakota, not common in western Oregon unless intentionally planted. Mara felt the investigation pivot again. If the victim had carried a pressed prairie coneflower in her locket, it might have been sentimental, a memory of home. She asked the lab to generate a genealogical profile from the victim's preserved tissue as well. It was a long shot, the sample was degraded, and funding would require another approval, but the sheriff signed off. In October 2019, a second DNA profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database that permitted law enforcement comparisons. The wait was shorter this time. Within weeks, several matches appeared, clustered in central Nebraska. The top match shared approximately 230 centimorgans, likely a second cousin. The name attached to the public profile was Rachel Kincaid. Mara made the call herself. Rachel was 34 and lived in Lincoln, Nebraska. She had taken a consumer DNA test out of curiosity about her ancestry. When Mara explained that the match might relate to an unidentified homicide victim from Oregon in 1987, there was a long silence on the line. "My aunt disappeared that year," Rachel said quietly. "My mom's sister. Her name was Emily Kincaid." Emily Kincaid was 23 when she vanished in March 1987. She left her hometown of Redfield, Nebraska, telling family she was heading west with a friend for seasonal work. After a few sporadic postcards from Colorado, the communication stopped. The family filed a missing persons report, but with no confirmed destination and limited interstate coordination at the time, the case faded. Rachel sent photographs. When Mara placed the photo of Emily beside the 1987 forensic reconstruction, the resemblance was undeniable. Same jawline, same slight asymmetry in the left eyebrow. Dental records were requested from a retired dentist's archived files. The comparison took 3 weeks. In November 2019, the Bryan County Sheriff's Office officially identified Alder Jane as Emily Marie Kincaid. 32 years after her death, she had her name back. Mara flew to Nebraska with the sheriff to meet the Kincaid family. Emily's mother had passed away in 2008 without knowing what happened to her daughter. Her younger sister, Diane, sat at the kitchen table holding the silver locket that had been mailed to her as part of the identification process. "I pressed that flower with her," Diane said, her voice steady but thin. "It was from our backyard." Closure is a complicated word. It does not erase loss, but it replaces ambiguity with truth. Now the focus sharpened. If Lucas Hale was connected through the Whitmore bloodline and Emily Kincaid had grown up in the same state as the Whitmore ancestral family, the likelihood of intersection increased. Mara began reconstructing Lucas's movements in early 1987. Employment records showed he worked intermittently for a construction subcontractor that handled highway maintenance across Oregon and Northern California. One project placed him near Bend in March 1987. Another crew was scheduled near Briar Glen in May. She subpoenaed archived payroll logs. The paper trail was incomplete but suggestive. A faded timesheet indicated Lucas had logged hours in Bryan County during the week of May 11, 1987. The week Emily Kincaid was killed. Still, a timesheet did not place him at the river. Mara needed biological confirmation. Because Lucas had never been arrested for a felony, his DNA was not in CODIS. The only lawful path forward was to obtain a discarded sample or request a voluntary swab. She opted for surveillance. In January 2020, two plainclothes deputies observed Lucas's daily routine. He shopped at the same grocery store every Tuesday morning, he drank coffee at a local diner, he smoked Marlboro Reds and discarded the butts in a public ashtray outside. On the third Tuesday, after Lucas left the diner, a deputy collected a cigarette butt from the ashtray using gloved hands and placed it in a sterile container. The sample was sent to the state lab for comparison against the 1987 semen profile. For weeks, the investigation held its breath. In March 2020, the results arrived. The DNA extracted from the cigarette butt matched the male profile recovered from Emily Kincaid's body in 1987. The statistical probability of the match being coincidental was astronomically low. For 33 years, the science was unequivocal. Mara read the report twice before walking it into the sheriff's office. "He's our guy," she said. An arrest warrant was drafted for Lucas Hale on charges of second-degree murder. But strategy mattered. Lucas was nearly 60. There was no indication he was armed or violent in recent years. Still, cold case arrests can trigger unpredictable reactions. On March 18, 2020, at 6:12 a.m., deputies approached Lucas's property. He answered the door in sweatpants and a thermal shirt, confusion etched across his face. "Lucas Hale?" Mara asked. "Yes." "We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1987 homicide of Emily Kincaid." The name hit him visibly. His eyes flickered, not in confusion, but recognition. "I don't know anyone by that name," he said too quickly. He was handcuffed without incident. At the station, after being advised of his rights, Lucas agreed to speak. For the first hour, he denied ever meeting Emily. He denied working in Briar Glen. He denied traveling with anyone from Nebraska. Mara placed the DNA report on the table. "This is your genetic profile," she said evenly. "Recovered from a cigarette you discarded last week. It matches biological evidence recovered from the victim in 1987. Lucas stared at the paper. DNA has a unique psychological weight. It is invisible, impartial, and relentless. "You can't prove anything," he muttered. "We just did," Mara replied. His posture shifted. Shoulders sagged slightly. The confidence drained. "She said she was 20, he said after a long pause. "We met at a bar in Bend. She wanted to head west. I gave her a ride." "What happened in Briar Glen?" Mara asked. He rubbed his face with both hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." He admitted they argued near the river after she threatened to report him for something he refused to clarify. He claimed he lost control. He insisted it was not premeditated. There was no remorse in his tone, only fatigue. The confession was recorded. The DNA sealed it. After 33 years, the case that began with a nameless girl by the river now had a victim and an offender identified. But the courtroom and the final reckoning still lay ahead. Lucas Hale's arrest traveled fast. In Briar Glen, older residents remembered the morning in 1987 when police tape lined the Alder Wash riverbank. In Redfield, Nebraska, the Kincaid family received calls from reporters before they had fully processed the fact that the man responsible for Emily's death was finally in custody. For Detective Mara Ionescu, the emotional arc of the case was secondary to procedure. A confession and a DNA match were powerful, but she knew better than to assume the outcome was guaranteed. 33 years had passed, memories faded, evidence aged. Defense attorneys scrutinized time like a weapon. The grand jury indictment came in April 2020. Lucas Hale was formally charged with second-degree murder. Because Oregon had no statute of limitations on homicide, the case moved forward without procedural barriers. Bail was denied. The defense strategy emerged quickly. Lucas's public defender did not dispute the DNA match. That would have been futile. Instead, he reframed it. Yes, Lucas had sexual contact with Emily Kincaid, but, he argued, it was consensual. There was no proof that the intercourse and the killing were linked in time. The state, he said, was filling gaps with assumptions. Mara expected that angle. The original autopsy report became critical. The medical examiner in 1987 had documented ligature marks consistent with strangulation occurring within hours of sexual activity. Bruising patterns suggested force, not intimacy. Though forensic terminology had evolved, the preserved photographs and notes held up under modern review. A contemporary forensic pathologist re-examined the case file and prepared to testify. Meanwhile, the prosecution built a narrative timeline. Phone records from 1987 were sparse, but payroll documentation placed Lucas in Broward County during the week of Emily's death. Witness statements from the original investigation mention a brown pickup truck seen near Mercer Bridge that night. DMV archives confirmed Lucas owned a brown 1979 Ford F-150 during that period. It was circumstantial reinforcement around a genetic core. The trial began in February 2021, delayed slightly by pandemic-related court restrictions. The courtroom was smaller than national cases that had captured headlines through genealogy breakthroughs, but the implications felt just as large. On the first day, Emily's sister Diane sat in the front row holding a folded tissue in her hand. She had aged decades since 1987. Grief changes posture. It tightens the jaw. The prosecutor opened with restraint. This case, he told the jury, is about science catching up with silence. It is about a young woman who left home seeking opportunity and never returned. And it is about the man whose DNA was left behind when she died. Mara testified on the third day. She walked the jury through the genealogy process carefully, anticipating skepticism. She explained centimorgans in plain language. She described how distant relatives who voluntarily uploaded their DNA to public databases created a genetic map. She clarified that the database used permitted law enforcement comparisons for violent crimes. The defense objected several times, suggesting privacy overreach. The judge overruled each objection, noting that no constitutional violation had occurred. When the state forensic analyst took the stand, the focus shifted from theory to mathematics. The DNA profile obtained from the defendant matches the male DNA recovered from the victim, the analyst said. The probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random with this same profile is approximately 1 in 8.3 quintillion. Numbers like that are abstract, but jurors understand improbability. Lucas Hale chose to testify. It was a calculated risk. He looked smaller than his booking photograph suggested. Gray hair cropped close, hands clasped tightly. He repeated his claim that he met Emily in Bend, that she agreed to sex, that an argument escalated. She threatened to tell people I hurt her, he said. I panicked. Did you strangle her? The prosecutor asked during cross-examination. I held her, Lucas said. I didn't mean to kill her. Intent matters legally, but the physical outcome remains the same. The prosecutor pressed further. After she stopped breathing, what did you do? Lucas hesitated. I left. You left her body by the river. Yes. You did not call for help. No. There are moments in trials when the room seems to contract. This was one of them. The defense attempted to introduce the idea that memory distortion over 33 years could affect Lucas's statements. They suggested that investigative pressure and the shock of confrontation influenced his account, but they could not dismantle the biological evidence. Closing arguments were concise. The prosecution emphasized three pillars: DNA, corroborating employment records, and Lucas's own admissions. The defense urged jurors to consider whether second-degree murder or a lesser charge was appropriate, arguing that panic, not premeditation, drove the act. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty. Lucas Hale was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Emily Marie Kincaid. At sentencing, Diane Kincaid addressed the court. "My sister wrote postcards about mountains and rivers. She trusted the world. You took that from her. You took decades from our family." Lucas did not look at her. The judge imposed a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years, acknowledging Lucas's age but emphasizing the severity of the crime and the prolonged absence of accountability. For Briar Glen, the verdict closed a chapter that had remained open since 1987. For the Kincaid family, it provided a form of resolution, though not peace. For Mara, the case represented something larger. Genealogical DNA had transformed the trajectory of cold cases across the country. It was not magic. It required preserved evidence, meticulous documentation, and cooperation from distant relatives who often had no idea their curiosity for ancestry might assist in solving a homicide. It also demanded ethical clarity. The department updated its policies to ensure transparency in future genealogical investigations. Community forums were held to explain how the database had been used and what safeguards existed. There were critics, of course. Some residents questioned the privacy implications. Others worried about a slippery slope. Mara understood those concerns. Technology moves faster than law, and trust must be earned. But she also remembered the original crime scene photos, the fog over the river, the nameless girl. Without genealogy, Emily Kincaid might have remained Alder Jane forever. In the months after the trial, Mara visited the Alder Wash riverbank alone. The reeds had grown thick again. The water moved quietly, indifferent to history. She thought about how DNA is both intimate and universal. It carries ancestry, identity, and sometimes guilt. It waits in freezers for decades without degrading its truth. Cold cases are not frozen in time. They are suspended, waiting for a method, a breakthrough, a shift in possibility. Emily Kincaid's case did not solve every unanswered question from 1987. It did not undo the years her mother spent wondering. It did not erase the fact that Lucas Hale lived freely for 30 decades after taking a life. But it proved something essential. Silence is not permanence. Evidence, if preserved, can outlive fear. Science can outlast denial. And sometimes justice arrives not with sirens, but with a spreadsheet of shared DNA segments that quietly narrow a family tree until there is only one branch left standing. That is the power and responsibility of genetic genealogy. And for one young woman who once carried a prairie coneflower in a silver locket, it meant her story did not end as a statistic by the river. It ended with her name spoken in a courtroom, on record, where it would not be forgotten again.